Hey guys, Ariel Phoenix here. Today we're going to be covering Release That Witch by Irmu. Now, Release That Witch is another transmigration novel. I read this on Web Novel. I've already talked about that a little bit on my Tyranny of Steel review. But essentially, Release That Witch falls under the exact same category where it's a transmigration story set in a medieval fantasy sort of world. Tyranny of Steel was more just pure medieval. This one has a fantasy aspect where witches essentially have magical power, and it introduces the whole dynamic of magic into this story world. So Release That Witch starts off with the protagonist being a mechanical engineer, unlike Tyranny of Steel, which I did review and should already be up by the time of this recording. He is a mechanical engineer versus in Afghanistan, a U.S. soldier in Afghanistan who dies from overwork instead of getting killed by an artillery strike. So this is a more stereotypical premise of these transmigration stories. It's a weird setting, but it's common enough that it's more standard. And the artillery strike one is very, very atypical. And honestly, the artillery strike just makes 10 times more sense than dying from keeling over from overwork. Like literally dying at his desk. Just, okay, whatever. So, in this particular instance, he is reincarnated, for lack of a better term, transmigrated into Roland Wimbledon? I can't say that off the top of my head. He is the third prince of Grey Castle, and there is essentially a fight to go on to take the crown for, they're deciding who's the heir. There we go. They're deciding who is the heir via this competition where how they govern each their respective cities is how they'll prove their standing. Roland was essentially the playboy black sheep of the family, and by no imagination is he the lowest on the bottom of the lowest rung of the ladder on getting on succeeding in this task. He's been sent to this border town, which is a backward area, and the others have been given ports and major bustling cities, and everybody just wants him to fail. And essentially, well, Roland actually dies from poison, and our mechanical engineer comes in and takes over his body and becomes the new Roland. So, shall we say this? That's your standard transmigration story setting. And in typical fashion of a transmigration, since he's a mechanical engineer, he wants to spark an industrial revolution, which is what these stories are great at. They're absolutely just great at civilization building and bringing in all the concepts that we as a civilization have learned back in time, and then speeding up that process, and it makes for typically a very interesting, enjoyable read. And the twist here is the witches. So it starts off with the witch Anne, who is on the cover. Speaking of which, now that I'm on the topic, the picture you see is the left-hand side is the original book version that I'm reading, and the right-hand side is essentially the comic version, which they are currently working on. If I remember correctly, the comic version is already 300 plus chapters in, so it's pretty far along. But so Anne is set to be executed at the gallows because witches are essentially in this world. The church has professed them worshippers of the devil and are demons, and their power is evil. They're basically evil incarnate. So our protagonist, and you can tell based off the title alone, decides to spare her. In the first glance, he uses the fact that Roland's kind of frivolous behavior to delay the execution, and then goes on to meet Anne, and that's where he really learns that, hey, there's magic in this place. And if I remember correctly, he's under some weird false assumption that he time traveled instead of transmigrated, but that's neither here nor there. But that in his mind sets more along the lines as like, hey, there's magic here. Now I gotta use this like to my advantage. And so essentially, the really interesting thing here is, unlike Tyranny of Steel, which in my review I talk about how everything goes so well here, well for the protagonist. Here he has to really like work for everything he has. So the very first thing he tries to do is introduce concrete, and the way he has to do that is by exploiting Anne's ability to control fire. And so he essentially uses the witch's abilities as the series goes on in a more industrial manner, which is actually very interesting because it is very counter to how most people view witches in the setting, and how he treats his people along those lines. It's a very solid, interesting read. But now let's go hit some of the awkward moments. First off, I have to admit, if I'm not mistaken, Ermu is a Chinese author, and it kind of shows in the translation. There are some really awkward translations like early on. This does get better with time. However, you're gonna have to read like, I think 200 chapters in was when the awkward translations kind of stopped, and then the typos began, and the grammar was whack. So first, the translations were wonky a little bit, then the grammar was a little whack, then they fixed that, then there was typos everywhere, 2 words blended together with no space. Reading it was a little weird. Now that I'm at chapter 860 plus, yeah, I'd say the translation team finally got their act together. Granted, I still have this is 1400 chapters, 1400 plus chapters, and I'm on an 860 plus, so there's still a ways for me to go. Now let's talk about the other awkward thing in this setting, in my personal opinion. There are a lot of different viewpoints, like perspectives in this story, and some of them are really weird in the fact that, why am I reading this dude's perspective when his role is simply to die? Or why did you spend so long on this particular character if you're just going to kill them off? There is one character, there's at least like 10 or 12 chapters from their perspective, and then they just get killed off. Like, what was the point of this character? Like, there was an actual interesting story kind of developing with this character, and how I was really interested to see how they were going to interact when they met the protagonist, and then they just got killed off. Just got killed off. Like, well, you just spent like 12 chapters on this one character intermittently, admittedly, and then you just kill them off. And then, so that's an issue. It jumps viewpoints pretty frequently. I'd say on an average of 15 chapters, let's say, I'd say about 10 are usually Roland's or pertaining witch, like one of the important witches. A lot of times it just goes off into some other person's perspective for a while, which I'd say 75% of the time, which is a pretty solid amount of the time, it develops the story. The other 25% just awkward. Just completely awkward. So now let's get into whether or not you should read this on web novel or wherever else. I'm reading it on web novel. I'm not a fan of web novel, but this is a good story. This is the story that actually got me onto web novel. So let's talk about, is it worth reading or paying money for? In my opinion, as much as I've been enjoying this, no, do not get into this unless you're in a little bit of a drought. There's nothing for you to read out there, nothing for you to enjoy. Then this is a solid pickup. But the difficulties on reading, if you're not already familiar with what I'm talking about, like reading machine translations of those types of things, that's going to be causing you issues. It's a little slow going forward. The concept and everything is great, and I enjoy them, but I just do not. And then there's web novels monetization of like purchasing each individual chapter. I think I had to spend like $150 buying the entirety of the whole story, which is expensive. But yeah, honestly, I would not recommend it unless you're in a little bit of content drought. As much as I've been thoroughly enjoying it, I do not recommend it. Have a good one, guys.